Hi there all. Hope you can hear me and see my screen. So, oh, sorry, okay. So yeah, as Cassie has mentioned, I'm Brandon Pearce. I am a Azure Solution Specialist here at Bytes, and my role in Bytes is to talk to our customers about certain things within Azure, and one of those things I enjoy talking about quite a lot is Windows Virtual Desktop. It's quite exciting, and there's a lot of desire for it within the industry at the moment. It's obviously, given the current times, that kind of makes a lot of sense. So our agenda for today will be quite simple. I'm going to go through a brief overview of what desktop virtualization is and what is WVD. I'll then go through some architecture and some concepts related to that, following by the actual technical requirements and the licensing requirements. I'll then mention some how you can serve that and manage that solution, and obviously some recommendations that we've uncovered as we've spoken with and dealt with our customers on an ongoing basis. Finally, we'll have a Q&A session where myself and my colleague Imran will be able to handle any questions that you may have relating to WVD and the account management of that. Okay. So let's get started with that introduction. So what is desktop virtualization and why is it beneficial? So desktop virtualization is often considered a solution for enabling centralized management and security of user desktops with hopefully less IT management and overhead within that solution. This allows you to have that separation of the operating itself, the operating system, the data and that application from local hardware. That means you'll have a solution that's running in a data center or centrally with that solution running on top of it, rather than having that running on a desktop or laptop. The main appeal is that separation of the compute environment from that user device, so that would greatly reduce the risk of confidential information being left on, say, a personal device that got stolen, or where you need to rebuild or redeploy a user to another physical device. So why WVD? So traditional desktop virtualization environments are often prohibitively expensive and technically complex to deploy. I know from my personal experiences that a successful implementation can take weeks or even months to complete, and that's where you've got the hardware on site already. Factoring in procurement of hardware and any other change management that might require can significantly extend those sort of times. Windows Virtual Desktops removes all that complexity by providing that backend infrastructure within Azure as a managed service. You don't have to worry about a lot of the infrastructure so that you would usually need to worry about. So things like gateways, brokers, load balancing, that sort of thing is all handled for you in the background. You're just basically providing some virtual machines to this solution. So compared to an on-premise solution, you greatly benefit from that immense capacity of Azure without having to worry about deploying and maintaining that backend infrastructure and roles. And you still maintain that full control over the VMs that you're going to be providing access to your users. So what is and where is desktop virtualization useful? Well, virtualization or desktop virtualization helps your organization address potentially specific operational needs, such as keeping data and organizational resources safe, while enabling that appropriate access for a variety of different users. You can consider documentation and compliance systems to support specific industry or local regulations. Think financial services, healthcare, government, those sort of institutions, or where you need to have access to those IT services on demand. If you have sort of an elastic workforce, be it, say, a merger and acquisition, short-term employees, contractors, partner engagements, that sort of stuff, where you need just on-demand access to those desktops, or where you need to meet specific employee needs. That can be, mobile devices, bring your own devices, staff and call centers, branch workers, that sort of scenario, or where you need to support specialized workloads, such as design engineering applications. And one thing where we see it, WVD very beneficial, is where you have a legacy application which is not going to be rebuilt, refactored, re-architected, any of those. It's going to be lifted and shifted into the cloud and run in the cloud as is, without having to worry about too much change to that. Maybe because the company's going through a transformation in the background, and this is just going to be a legacy application which is just required for a given amount of time, and it doesn't make sense to the business to transform that in any reasonable way, where WVD can help provide that application to its users still in a modern approach. But in reality, where can WVD be used, or where is it useful? It's pretty much any situation where you have a need to connect people to their applications in order for them to perform their job, their function, and to be successful. The only use case which is not really supported or isn't supported is where an offline situation, where a user needs something in an environment that is totally offline and segregated from the internet. WVD is an online solution and will require access to the internet to be able to access the solution. So the architecture. The architecture of WVD is quite simple. There's parts that Microsoft manage, and then there's going to be parts of it which you manage. From the point of view of clients, those people accessing the solution, they can access that the solution using pretty much any device or operating system, at least any modern device and operating system today, be that Windows, Mac OS, iOS, Android, or just a HTML5 compliant browser. I've even tested it on my Samsung TV, and that works. So users will connect to the solution. They will connect into, and that solution will they'll then have access in the background to the Microsoft managed bits and pieces of this. In the background, that's where the users will be directed to the closest WVD control plane, which is actually serviced by Azure Front Door and Azure Traffic Manager. That control plane is provided as part of the service and managed by within Azure. You don't need to provision any of it. You just access the service. That would include the things like the gateways and the brokers that we mentioned previously. So if you're familiar with RDS, it's all of that in the background. But unlike RDS on Windows Server, and as a major evolution of RDS, those servers aren't actually running in the background as virtual machines that Microsoft is supplying. They actually have ported that service to app service, allowing Microsoft to be able to provide that solution in a very modern approach, and allows Microsoft to easily update that service without any real impact to your use of that service. And the cadence at which they do those updates is quite impressive. Again, that is all provided by Microsoft. When you use the service, you don't need to do anything other than consume the service. So there's no procurement, no delivery, no racking of hardware, none of those traditional delays associated with deploying the back end of a VDI or RDS type solution. The customer managed aspect of the solution is will sit within your subscription, and that will be what you manage and have full access to. This is where those virtual machines and related services that you'll utilize will be deployed, and where you have total control, and Microsoft has no visibility of what you're actually doing, and nor would they want that. That would include, obviously, the virtual machines as mentioned, some domain services and storage, which we'll get into later. Those virtual machines, by the way, will sit on a virtual network, and you can choose to have that virtual network connect back to on-premises solutions, for example. So if you need to make use of a line of business application or some storage or anything that's sitting on-prem, you can have a VPN or an express route connecting back to that environment so that you have full access from Azure back to your on-prem. The same way as if you have services sitting in Azure, you can access them from on-prem. And obviously, you can grant users access to internet-based services, so Office 365 and any other SaaS offerings you might utilize for your users. Some WVD terminology that is worthwhile understanding upfront. The first main thing is a workspace. That is that when a user logs in, that is the first thing that they'll interact with. This is where those users will launch the services that you've provided to them as part of an application group, which we'll go into. A host pool is that collection of one or more virtual machines which act as the session host for the solution. This is what users will actually access and where their compute and OS requirements will be sitting. And those host pools can support either a pooled or personal. So pooled is multi-session and personal is a single session, a dedicated VM option. The application group is basically what links those resources in the workspace to the underlying resources provided by the host pool. So when a user connects into the workspace, they'll be presented with a number of icons. Those icons are effectively the application groups. And those application groups can either be a traditional remote desktop, so a fully fledged desktop environment. So if you're familiar with like RDP or anything of that nature, traditional Citrix, it'll be that full desktop experience, or it could be a remote app, which is going to be the streaming of a particular application to the user rather than the full desktop experience. So for example, you can have a line of business application installed on a host pool, and maybe the Office suite as well. And it's possible to have a application group expose that full remote desktop to some users, and the line, use remote app to present just the line of business application on that same host group to another set of users, depending on those users' requirements. So host pools, just go into a bit more detail. Pooled is where you'll have a single virtual machine which will support multiple users simultaneously. This is by far the most common deployment and the most cost-effective given the use of shared resources. The VMs used in the pool need to be sized adequately to support those user workloads. But one of the downsides of the pool is that is this concept of a noisy neighbor, where one user within a shared VM does something which uses a significant proportion of that compute resource available to them, causing other users to have a degraded performance. The Personal alleviates some of those problems. Personal is a single virtual machine per user, so a true VDI type environment. It provides that a resolution to some of those issues found with the pooled environment, such as noisy neighbor. It's typically used for users of applications requiring more intense compute performance, such as graphics workstations. It's also often used for where you have a requirement to support a user who needs a dedicated virtual machine, the same virtual machine each time, perhaps a VIP who demands full local admin rights to their machine, and they want to be able to install software and do whatever they want. That's probably where you'll use a personal desktop with direct assignment. It's also possible to support in personal operating systems which don't support multi-session. Now, talking about operating systems and which operating systems are supported, under personal, as we were just talking about that, it does support Windows 7, but only as a published desktop, as a full desktop. It doesn't support remote app, and also Windows 10 Enterprise. In the pooled, where you're looking at multi-sessions, you do have the option for Windows 10 multi-session, and you have the option for server operating systems, so 2012 and above. Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session allows for multiple users connect to a single instance of Windows 10. This has not been possible before within a Windows desktop environment, at least not in a supported way. Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session is a feature of Windows Virtual Desktop. It is not a feature or version of Windows 10. That means that this is not available anywhere else. And as I said, The pooled environment also supports Windows Server 2012 and above. This does allow you to migrate any on-premise RDS session hosts into the WVD management plane should you want to maybe move from on-prem into the cloud. That could potentially be an option. One thing to consider when using a server OS in Azure is you will still need to pay for that server OS, whereas with a Windows 10 or actually multi-session or desktop OS, you only pay for the compute cost, that base compute cost of the virtual machine, so like the Linux price, if you're familiar with that. And that comes down to licensing, which we'll go into the specifics of more later. Okay. So just some background. Customers in the past have really only had two choices when it comes to deploying a Windows-based VDI solution, basically Windows Server, as we mentioned, and a Windows client operating system. With Windows Server, the RDS role has been a great way to provide a scalable solution for multiple users on the same session host. But since it's a Windows Server operating system, customers may have found some limitations and compatibility issues with running applications in that multi-session environment. For example, it only supports Win32 applications, so no UWP applications, nothing from the Microsoft Store, for example. And due to it being on the LTS, the long-term servicing channel, feature-rich updates to the OS are infrequent, usually 3 to 5 years. Now, some of those server-related issues could have been mitigated with a traditional VDI solution with a client OS. So that would be the dedicated virtual machine per user running a desktop OS. Obviously, a Windows desktop OS usually benefits from much better application compatibility, such as full UWP apps, OneDrive files on demand, that sort of stuff, things that can be deployed from Microsoft Store. It also provides that modern Windows experience within the semi-annual channel, meaning that you get those you can get feature-rich updates up to twice a year. The same as for your desktops and laptops. However, a typical VDI solution, given the fact that it's a single virtual machine per user, will usually require a lot more infrastructure than a multi-session solution, so generally a bit more expensive to run. Microsoft fills that gap with the traditional server and desktop operating system with Windows 10 multi-session feature in WVD. This delivers basically the best of both worlds. So it allows multiple users to access a single virtual machine running a Windows 10 operating system. So this should remove many of the application compatibility issues with a server operating system, allowing you to run Win32, UWP apps, those sort of things. And it provides that familiar Windows 10 user experience, which can be the same as what you're delivering on a physical device. So yeah, and again, that's all provided to you as part of, so at least with Windows 10 and Office, you can have the latest up-to-date applications running in your virtualized environment and being delivered and orchestrated through an always up-to-date management plane managed by Microsoft. So back to some of the terminology. With the host pool, there's a number of two different ways of doing load balancing. There's breadth and depth. The breadth load balancing algorithm will attempt to distribute users to the least used virtual machines in the host pool. So this will ensure the best possible user experience and performance by making sure that the fewest number of users are going to be attached to any particular virtual machine. This does mean that you probably have a slightly higher cost because you'll be distributing over a potentially larger number of running virtual machines. In depth, the load balancing will assign users to a single virtual machine until a defined limit is met. So for example, you could have a virtual machine, you've tested and understood that that limit is going to be 10 users, or 10 concurrent users. Once it hits 10, the 11th user will then go to the next virtual machine in the algorithm, will select that virtual machine that has the fewest number of users and try to fill that virtual machine up with enough users to meet that limit. Obviously, when users are now logging on and off, the algorithm will start looking for those virtual hosts which are, more utilized to try and get to that maximum thing. The depth mode works really well for lighter workloads, we find, or very well understood workloads. So you've sized the virtual machines correctly to for those number of users that are going to be on that virtual machines. Because one thing that we do find is if you put in a solution like WVD and the user experience is bad, that user experience will be remembered. Even if you improve it later on, that initial user experience will quite often permeate through the life cycle of the solution. And internally, that can cause some concerns just because the perceived performance issues may have stemmed from early experiences. So yeah, depth will be great at minimizing costs because you could potentially have fewer virtual machines running at any given point in time to maintain that solution. So, for example, out of hours, you could have many fewer virtual machines running and rather than during office hours. Within an application group that sits all up on top of those that host pool effectively, you have two options: remote desktop, which we've discussed, and remote app, we've discussed in a bit. So remote desktop is obviously that familiar desktop experience. You connect to it, you'll see a taskbar and start menu, everything that you're accustomed to you having on-prem or on physical hardware, that will be provided to you within a remote desktop connection. Remote app, on the other hand, as mentioned, it's basically streaming of just the application that's installed on that host pool rather than the entire desktop experience. Now, the great thing about that, especially on something like Windows 10, is the remote app will behave like a normal application, especially on Windows 10. So in Windows 10, you can pin that application to the start menu, to the taskbar. You'll just see a little glyph on top of the standard icon. So for example, if you have something like, say, Word, you can have Word installed on your laptop. You can have Word within a remote app, and that remote app-based version of Word will just have like a little glyph as on the icon and just state that it's from that app pool. So users can work with that in the same sort of way that they would work with a normal application. And if you're using something like iOS or Android, so on a tablet or something of that nature, if you're exposing just the application, you're basically just getting that experience across the screen, which might make it a lot more easier for those users to utilize within that environment rather than having to navigate between a full desktop. And just to tie it all together, on the right-hand side there, you'll see the object model for WVD within ARM and how those workspaces, host pools, and app groups all tie together. On the left-hand side, you can see an example of that being utilized. So just to go through that briefly, you can obviously see that you have a set of sales users distributed across one geography. Those users have access to an application group. That application group, depending on the users, is exposing either a desktop or a remote app, and that is all being provided on top of a host pool of a number of different virtual machines. Whereas the engineering team, which is geographically dispersed, they each have access to a personal desktop that sits on top of a different host pool, which is probably locally, those VMs could be locally allocated rather than being centrally located, or at least within the Azure data centers. So for example, looks like one is in Europe there. Another one looks to be a little bit towards India. Those could be provided by virtual machines in those areas. So onto some of the WVD requirements. The first one is always the fun bit, which is the licensing part. So with a client operating system, so Windows 10 Multisession, Windows 7, Windows 10 Enterprise, you will need basically a Windows E3 or above license. If you're an academic, then it's going to be the A3 equivalent. That might be included as part of one of your your M365 bundles, as listed there. You can see the M365 E3, E5 are quite common, Business Premium. And for partners, this might be where you might have a potential upsell. So for example, if you're dealing with a smaller business, maybe they're running M365 Business Standard at the moment. If they want to use WVD, that's a small increase in cost from standard, or relatively small increase in cost from standard to Business Premium. And then you get in the benefits of Business Premium, for example, such as some additional Intune-based capabilities, some additional Azure Active Directory capabilities, and the ability to run Office 365 within WVD. If you're going to use a server operating system, so not only will you need to pay for the server OS in some way within Azure, you're also going to need an RDS CAL with active software insurance. So on-premise, you might be using a normal CAL. If it doesn't have software assurance, you will need to replace that with a license with software assurance. If you're a hosting provider, your RDS cells, as far as we understand, cannot be utilized with WVD. And I suspect that's done on purpose. So it will be a RDS CAL with software assurance. And since you're also paying for the operating system within Azure, migrating to Windows 10 Multisession could actually be quite a saving in an ongoing saving. So just something to bear in mind when you are looking at WVD and the license requirements to actually use them. So from a technical requirement, just some of the basic stuff that you will need, some options as well. Obviously, Azure Active Directory, so this will be something that a customer, if they already have Office 365, they already have that Azure Active Directory, that tenant. If not, Azure Active Directory, it can be done, the free version will work. You will then also need to utilize some domain services, and we'll go into identity after this. And there's two options for that. There's either using Azure Active Directory domain services, or if the customer already has something like Windows Server Active Directory, possibly already in sync with AAD, then they can either use domain controllers that are already on-prem, or you can create another domain controller in the cloud for that service. You also need a subscription for Azure Active Directory for Azure. Obviously, that's where you'd run your domain services in as well. On top of that, you will also require at least a virtual machine and all its required components, such as virtual networks, disks, all that stuff to get it up and running. And then you optionally have some file storage requirements, and that will be for some additional stuff, such as FSlogix profiles, or if you want to do some MSI App Attach, which we'll go into in a bit. So when you're connecting to the WVD solution, when the users connect to the solution with using the client or through the HTML5 browser, they will be challenged using Microsoft Modern Authentication to get access to that solution. So before they present it with anything, they'll go through that Modern Authentication login process, the same as if you were logging into a Office 365 service or anything of that nature. And the same process that you have in place for Office 365 or anything else in Azure Active Directory, that will get triggered when you're logging into the service. So if you have some conditional access, if you have some MFA in place, those requirements will need to be met before the user can log into the service successfully. And then once they're in that service, they'll then be presented with those that workspace that they'll be able to launch their applications from. With a cloud-based identity, rather than having domain controllers in the cloud, that's where you'll sync from Azure Active Directory to the Azure Active Directory Domain Services solution. Now, Active Directory Domain Services is not exactly the same as Windows Server Active Directory if you haven't used it before. It is a service. It doesn't expose to you exactly as domain controllers. It doesn't support everything that Windows Server Domain Services does, but it does provide a great way for providing domain services within Azure, especially if you're moving to a modern workplace style of environment where your identity provider is going to be primarily Azure AD, and you're probably moving away from traditional ADDS. So Azure Domain Services, great option for that. It does mean that you don't have to worry about managing and maintaining operating systems on virtual machines. All those virtual machines is just a service that you consume, and it does synchronize from Azure Active Directory to domain services, and will allow virtual machines to be domain bound as required by WVD currently. A hybrid identity is just basically where you're going to have domain controllers either on-prem or in the cloud. This is particularly useful if you are just looking to move things from on-prem to the cloud, or you're going to be supporting some on-prem services, or you still have that requirement to maintain standard domain services that we've been using for many years in the past. This might require some connectivity from the on-prem to the site, so ExpressRoute site-to-site VPN, and you'd synchronize, as you might already be doing, from Active Directory to Azure Active Directory using something like, say, Azure AD Connect. So if you've already got Office 365 and you've got a customer who's already doing Azure AD Connect, or using that yourselves, then those profiles, that's already in place. Everything you have for that purpose is already there. You just need to start consuming the domains, the WVD solution, and just bind your virtual machines to those domain controllers. FSlogix is a great little solution that Microsoft acquired about 2 years ago now. The main solution when using it with the WVD is that profile containerization. So in a pooled environment, in that multi-session environment, your users are not necessarily going to be connecting to the same virtual machine every single time, which means that if they don't have some way of segregating out that user profile, every time they connect to the solution, it's possible that they're going to have to reset up that profile, or something's going to happen to make sure that they have a profile created when they connect to a virtual machine. That does mean that potentially they're going to end up with a situation where they have different profiles on different virtual machines, which might be out of sync, and there might be some configuration differences between those. FSlogix removes that issue by taking that user profile and putting it into a VHD, which is then presented to the virtual machine over SMB-based storage. So we'd usually recommend Azure Files Premium for that. And that means that you have a virtual machine which doesn't actually have any user profiles stored on them. They just have the applications potentially, meaning that should something go wrong with the virtual machine, you can get that out of service, and users can reconnect quite easily to another VM within the environment, and their profile then follows them. Or each day that they connect in, they'll then at least have that same experience. And to the user, that process is invisible. They won't realize, unless they look hard enough, they probably won't even know that they're on a different virtual machine each time they connect. Another couple options within that FSlogix solution is app masking. So if you do have a requirement within a host group, for example, to limit what users can and cannot see, or different sets of users being able to see different things, you can use app masking. Now, obviously, that is possible using other technologies, but it's also provided as part of FSlogix. And then if you are doing some Java, then there's an ability to do some Java redirection to make sure that Java apps use the correct version, so you can have multiple Java versions with them also JREs installed. Some storage options for FSlogix, as I mentioned, there's Azure Files. Another solution within Azure is Azure NetApp Files. What I haven't mentioned in here, because it's ideally you don't want to be doing virtual machines in the cloud, is just a virtual machine or set of virtual machines, possibly even using a storage space as direct. So between Azure Files and Azure NetApp Files, there are a number of different options, but what you will find is that Azure NetApp Files, whilst it does have a lower latency and can handle higher IOPS, does tend to be pretty pricey. As you can see from the minimum capacity, you will need at least 4 terabytes compared to a minimum premium of 100 gigabytes. Azure Files Premium is also, I think it was in November or December, had I think about a 30% price reduction, so that has just gotten cheaper over time. So servicing and management of those devices. One option, I mean, there's a number of ways of handling how you service those VMs once they go, that life cycle of those VMs once they become session hosts. And one of those options would be to use basically whatever you're currently using. So if you're using something like Configuration Manager, or you have other processes or services in place for managing servers and VMs, those services can be utilized within WVD. That's not necessarily going to be the most ideal solution, but it will depend on what your business requirements are. So that would take a fairly traditional approach to servicing those VMs. So you have a VM, it requires some patches, it could be deployed via something like Configuration Manager, it could be deployed through just connecting directly to the internet. That's all perfectly supported. Another option could be to use something like the shared image gallery. So the shared image gallery allows you to create your own customized version of Windows and store that as a image within Azure. You can distribute that globally, and so they're available in different regions. And one way to then consider managing your systems is to consider those VMs as being disposable. So instead of exposing, worrying about the VM itself, when it comes to updating that VM, instead of actually updating the VMs themselves that are currently in the host pool, it's possible to consider them as disposable and just redeploy new applications from a recently updated image in the shared image gallery. So you could potentially do that for updates, for additional software, and you just deploy that. And now another great thing about using something like the shared image gallery, and this also really depends on business continuity and disaster recovery requirements of the business, is one option could be as a VM, if you're familiar with Azure Site Recovery, is you could replicate those VMs from one site to another site. So from UK South, for example, to UK West. But obviously you're paying for that site recovery service each month, and you're also paying for the replication and storage of that disk that then sits in the secondary site. If you go the shared image gallery route of and considering those VMs as disposable, because one, the user profile is now not sitting on that, and there's a possibility to not have the application sitting on the image on the host. You can then look at, in the event of a disaster, because you'd have those processes to set up and deploy and those images, is to look at not having anything, at least in terms of the virtual machines being replicated into a secondary site. You just go through the process of deploying through an automated process, the same way you'd do an update. You just deploy new virtual machines into the secondary site and expose those to users. You just need to make sure that your SLAs around business continuity, disaster recovery are met by that process rather than just replicating. Replicating would likely be quicker, but shared image gallery would likely be cheaper. I mentioned applications not being installed on virtual machines. There is a new technology, or well, newly released to WVD, is something called MSI App Attach. And basically this is the delivery of applications in a different way to what we're used to doing. Basically, it containerizes that application, stores that within SMB storage, and allows you to attach that MSIX container to a virtual machine or multiple virtual machines and present that application to your users on demand. It's actually remarkably quick and simple to actually add and attach and remove those VMs, but currently it's a little bit of a process to actually get your applications into a MSIX package. But once that's done, the session host then becomes just a, well, you can consider it ephemeral, it's disposable. The users are sitting in profiles segregated from the virtual machines. The applications are sitting segregated from those virtual machines, and they can really be considered as disposable virtual machines at that point, with the applications being and users being segregated from that. The beauty of that is those applications, because they're not actually installed on the virtual machine, all you need to do is update, replace the package that is sitting on the shared storage, and the next time users use those, or the application is reattached for those users, they will get the latest version of that application. And that can be quite beneficial to the whole process of supporting users in this environment. So another thing provided by Microsoft is a set of scripts to do some session host autoscaling. So where we've mentioned about host pools having a number of users, and especially where you're looking at that depth load balancing, it's possible to then have virtual machines that are powered off out of hours and then powered on when required, so that you can minimize those costs. So some recommendations. So session sizing, this is actually from Microsoft's documentation. If you're looking at the size of these virtual machines, if you're using the Azure pricing calculator, my recommendation, if you're not particularly certain about the requirements that you have, the size of virtual machine that you need, look at the D and E series, the V3s or V4s, where the D series has half the amount of memory as the E series. And consider the workload, if you're using the calculator, especially consider the workload types of medium and heavy, and some additional stuff. Generally recommend premium SSDs for production workloads of the session hosts. Generally don't recommend standard HDDs for those users. If you're doing some single sessions, try to get at least 8 gigs of RAM on there, and at least 2 physical CPUs. So if you're using a family like the DSV3 mentioned there, that uses hyperthreading, so you do 4 CPUs there. Check out the Azure Compute Unit documentation for more additional information on how Azure splits out those physical CPUs to virtual CPUs. And then generally we don't recommend using the B series burstable VMs in production environments unless you've understood the workloads that I was going to run on those VMs. They might work well in personal host pools, they might work well for testing and that sort of stuff, but generally we don't find burstable, those really cheap VMs, that working really well in most production environments, just given how B series works with the CPU. So check out the documentation on the B series if you're not familiar with burstables. In terms of GPUs, the AMD based solutions in there are quite affordable. There's also the NCAS T3 VMs, V4s. Those are the T4 Tesla T4 solution. Those are also quite affordable. Those are great for where you need rich media or graphically intensive programs. Some new documentation on Microsoft has been released showing how considering bandwidth considerations. And if you go for a VM which supports, rather than H.264, supports the AVC codec with 444 color space, for those users of higher, where they're going to be using video, they're going to be doing some more graphically intense workloads, the bandwidth can actually drop quite substantially, which could also affect your bandwidth utilization costs within Azure. So definitely something worth considering is deploying those GPU-based solutions. The NVIDIA one specifically, the NVAS V4s, provide a really good solution, even for knowledge workers. In terms of sizing, we would usually recommend Azure Files Premium for FSlogix. We would also recommend, well, some of the basic sizing that Microsoft provides is 30 gigabytes of storage, profile storage per user, or per named user. So some configuration options are shown here. I will distribute the slide deck if you require it. But some of the things to consider if you are going to use FSlogix is the flip-flop profile directory name, because by default, it's SID then username, which is very difficult to, as an administrator, to go and find a particular VHD for a particular user. Whereas if you do the flip-flop, it changes it to username _ SID. So it'll be much easier to find that user profile disk for that particular user should you have an issue. Also setting the size in megabytes from the default could potentially help you limit the amount of storage that you utilize if you find that 30 gigabytes is not useful or too large. Also, if you are using FSlogix, and you're going to have an antivirus solution installed, just make sure that you exclude the following things on the screen. Again, as I said, we can provide this to you, and then those processes. If you don't, you'll find that your CPU consumption within those virtual machines will increase quite dramatically. You can also now enable some diagnostics and monitoring. That's all now integrated and GA'd. So definitely have a look at that, just so that you can get a good idea of what's actually occurring within your environment, not just from the virtual machine itself, but actually what's happening within those guests, so you can manage and monitor that in a worthwhile way. If you are going to use Teams within WVD, one thing to remember is that the Teams experience within a VDI solution is not going to be identical to that on-prem. So for example, if you're doing a meeting with multiple users, the user might only see 2 users on the screen rather than say 49. It will also impact your bandwidth utilization. Again, this is where things like GPUs might become useful to help alleviate the CPU utilization and to alleviate some of the bandwidth issues. And also, again, with FSlogix and Teams, just make sure there's some folders that are synced and some that aren't, just to minimize the storage requirements. If you're going to be using Azure Pricing Calculator to price up a solution, some of the things that are a bit annoying is that when you add the Windows Virtual Desktop option to the estimate, it only allows for a minimum of 100 named users. And if you're building that for a solution which is significantly less than that, you type in the number and it comes up, and it'll just automatically go back to 100. So what we suggest there is just adjusting the concurrency so that that peak concurrency and that off-peak concurrency just adjusted accordingly. And also in the solution, you may find that if you select the reservation cost, that cost will increase, the WVD cost will increase, because the generic cost for the solution is going to be based on 220 hours, whereas a reservation is assuming the full month. If you need to add file storage, you can find that under the storage account, and we'd again recommend usually anything over 5 users premium storage. And again, going back to the storage being the number of named users times 30. So if you know you're going to be doing 50 users, you're going to times it by 30, you're going to get 1.5 terabytes of usage. And if you want to get an understanding of bandwidth, worst case scenario, and you don't want to go through the whole process of figuring out exactly what each user is going to be using, I generally just err on just using 30 gigs per user per month. So if you've got 30 gigs and the 50 gig, you're getting 1.5 terabytes. That should be roughly about £90 currently. Now, there are certain situations where you won't pay for bandwidth egress, but I would always err on the side of caution and just add that additional cost into the structure. Obviously, the only other thing to then add into this would be domain service. And lastly, if you're going to be using, especially WVD in Windows 10 multi-session in WVD, look at this desktop optimization toolset that is available through Git. It allows you to remove some of those additional services which are probably unneeded within WVD or through a hosted platform, just to optimize the amount of additional threads and additional services that are running within your session hosts to optimize those the available performance for users, and helping you then possibly also minimize the amount of RAM and CPU that is actually required for each session host. Again, that script should always be run after a session host has been created. So if you are going some infrastructure as code to deploy virtual machines, especially as we mentioned within the shared image gallery to deploy new machines, make sure that this is set to run after that, and that can be done as a custom script extension. And just within time, that ends it for me. Please, if you have any questions, let us know. Hopefully a whole bunch have come through.
Thank you, Brandon, and thank you everybody for sitting in and listening. Hope you found it interesting. We do have a few questions, so I'm just going to read them out. If you do have anything you want to ask, just put them in the questions box on the right-hand side of the screen. So someone's asked, can we use Azure Files for storage, as ideally would not want to spool up a dedicated file server?
Definitely, and that would be the approach I would take. Definitely. Where Azure Files will support your requirements. So Azure Files is not a direct replacement for the services provided by a Windows File Server. There's some nuances with that. You know, if that's a requirement, we can discuss that. But for most customers in most situations, Azure Files is going to be ideal. Just make sure that the performance of the tier that you're choosing is aligns to your requirements. So you know, we've mentioned in the slides Azure Files Premium, but it could be that Azure Files Transaction Optimized, for example, could provide sufficient for you know, performance, and also provide a cost benefit compared to Premium.
Great, perfect. Got another question here. It could be, Imran, it might be one that you might be able to actually help on as well. It's a little bit more around costing, but not specifically. So hi, we have a few WVD Windows 10 multi-session devices, mainly for testing or doing tasks such as running PowerShell scripts. We keep an eye on pricing, become a bit crazy and get billed by Microsoft a month in arrears. How would this work with Bytes and our customers? Do we purchase resource subscriptions in advance, or are we billed a month behind and back bill the customer? It's an exciting prospect, which is why we are trialing it, but the headache seems to be around logistical billing and monitoring costs rather than technical ones at the moment. And that, I mean, that could be a sort of question that a lot of people might be thinking. So is either one of you able to give some more insight on that?
Well, I can start with some of the technical stuff if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it.
Just something to consider at the moment is you mentioned running some scripts in that as part of WVD. Obviously, I'm not, you know, with that limited information, you might want to consider running those scripts within something like Azure Functions or something like that. That'll be a lot cheaper to run that potentially than running it within a, what's it called? If you are using it for administrative purposes, you might want to then also consider Azure Bastion, which might provide a better solution for that. But I'll hand over to Imran for costings.
Yeah, so just looking at your current subscription, I'm assuming you're purchasing directly from Microsoft via the pay-as-you-go model or Web Direct. If that's correct, then you're always going to be paying a higher fee on that subscription, and the concept works the same as that as within CSP, because it's all based on consumption. Whatever you consume in one given month, you'll get billed at the following month, and therefore you can end up, therefore you have to retrospectively bill your customers. So that's always been the same model across all the licensing models with CSP. But it'll be interesting to take this offline and actually understand who you're procuring from, exactly the model and the subscription type, and then we can work out how it's best to work with Bytes, because we're quite open in terms of the pricing we get, whether it's Azure Legacy or if it's Azure Plan, because there's a different model of earning partner and credits than there is from making a margin uplift as well. So happy to take that offline and cover that in the questions and pass it over to the rest of the attendees as well.
Yeah, great, perfect. We have another question. So are there any options other than the native Microsoft tooling to manage WVD in Azure, Brandon?
Yeah, so we offer a couple options, specifically through our EUC team. There are things such as Citrix, VMware Horizon that offer options to utilize those services and consume WVD in the background. So the management of that will happen through the cloud services that they offer rather than through the portal itself. And there are a few other options which our EUC teams can work with you on that can work just with the native solution should you require that, rather than the tooling and native tool sets that are available.
Great. Thank you. Are there any services Bytes can offer to get started with WVD, for example, deployment and architecture?
Yep. We have a couple workshops that are on offer. The one is our WVD Quick Start service, where basically we work with the customer to set up WVD, fairly rudimentary setup of WVD, so you can play with WVD in a proof of concept environment, so you can get to grips with it. Particularly useful for customers who are looking at, say, moving from on-prem solutions or Citrix or Horizon to WVD and want to understand the administrative and management differences without having to go and learn the entire solution itself. Another one that we are also going to be offering is what we're calling a WVD Velocity Workshop, which is a one-day engagement, which is more of a training exercise, more of a deep dive, going into much more detail than I have today, going through that, and then also doing some demos, some demonstrations, some building exercises, and it can actually deliver some aspects of WVD in an environment for you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Brandon. And if anyone's interested in any of that, you can, you can email tell me more at bytes.co.uk. Reach out to a Bytes account manager if you're in touch with one. You can also make a note on one of the questions on the survey at the end, just in one of the boxes where there's the option to put a short answer, and you can add in just say that you're interested in more information on around some of the workshops. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up there. It's now just gone 3:30, and I appreciate that some of us probably have other calls and meetings to join. So I just want to say thank you to Brandon for your time today and for delivering all